So I was going to try to be from my yoga platform, which is across the lake, but it's kind of cold out. So hopefully you can kind of see some of the trees behind me, trying to give you a good view of today's Facebook Live. So, okay, where do we begin today? What a week, right? So I just want to check in with everyone. As you know, I call you revolutionaries, and there's no better time than a bunch of revolutionaries to be needed, right? So just wanted to check in, see how things were going. I was just totally hoping to hear stories of success, or as my friend J-Lo would say, how you've leveraged your strengths this week. If you can tell, short-term memory is not really serving me well. I can't remember words, and it's been quite a week, right, Beth? So I wanted to jump in, see how everybody was doing, think about how we could leverage our strengths, think about where we've had successes. I really appreciated our colleague post that Laura Fish shared, and it was like, you know, in this rush to like see all the possibilities, we maybe don't sit with the struggle long enough. And I'm like, I'm done with the struggle. I'm ready for the possibilities. But there's much to be said to taking just a minute. And as Alyssa from Seed and Sow would also say, allow ourselves to process these big emotions. And I keep finding mine to be really big. And I'm like, seriously, I have really no significant problem, but I am like riding high and riding low most of the time. So just beautiful to see you all. If you have a success you want to share, drop it in the chat, send out some hearts, and then just hopefully that'll vibrate out into the rest of the world as well. I want to talk a little bit about some legal and procedural things that went around this week. Just make sure you guys all are in the know. I really want to make sure that we talk about young children generally, and then young children with IEPs more specifically, because the more marginalized you are or were before a crisis, the more marginalized you will likely be during the crisis, and hopefully not afterwards. Hopefully that's where the possibility comes in that we will absolutely see the world differently and behave differently as we find our way in this journey. So, let us know. Let's celebrate anything that's possible, as well as share any big emotions that you've been figuring out how to process through. And then let's talk a little bit about procedural and legal things. I am not a lawyer, so all of this is the world according to Christy. I listened to several things from lawyers and from experts, and I'm just going to kind of give you the Cliff Note versions. Everything I'm going to mention, all of the links and then some more, are in today's Facebook Live. So you can go ahead and set up, you can go to the Facebook event for today, and all of the links are there. So if you need anything at all, or if you have a question, just put it here in the chat and I'll get to it after the live event if I missed something before the event. Okay. So one of the fellow revolutionaries asked me this last week, what is Section 619? And that got me to thinking that we need to clarify some things that are unique to preschool, especially preschoolers with identified disabilities. And then again, back to that idea about we want to find ways that we can stop marginalizing people and different humans in our community, as well as think about the risk that we have for the marginalized groups. So 619, again, World According to Christy, is when you look at federal law, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act in particular, there is a section. There are 4 parts, and one of the sections of one of the parts is Section 619. And so there's some special rules and regulations and language around it. So I just thought I'd quickly say, because you can Google Section 619 and Rights Law or other places, or just read what federal law says about Section 619, or reach out to your Section 619 coordinator. Every state has one in here in the U.S. There are 3 big things for me that Section 619 deviates from K-12. And so just being aware of that, in terms of eligibility, both in the labels that we give, unfortunately, we do give labels, but there are differences there. Language around what is the responsibility of the eligibility team for preschoolers. So that's just Section 619. And then, so eligibility, what's your IEP, some of the pieces and parts of it in terms of how you write your present level and how you write your needs and how you write your goals, and then how you design specially designed instruction is the next place. There's a little bit of difference. And then the third place is we have some special reporting that we do to the Office of Special Education Programs that is just for infants and toddlers and preschoolers. So any of you who have done Indicator 7 or some other ones, and you have to decide if the child's making progress in 3 broad areas, getting their wants and needs met, increasing their knowledge and skills, and I'll think about the third one here in a minute. That's all OSEP reporting, and that's unique to infants and toddlers, which is part C, which there's A, B, C, and D of IDEA, and then section 619, which is section 619 of part B of IDEA. So those are the 3 places that preschool pops up a little bit differently. Most of what I'll talk about today is the practical part. But again, there were some really helpful webinars and some helpful podcasts this week to help understand what are our obligations in this time of whatever we want to call it, okay? But first, it was important to answer what is 619 so that we knew that if our district or our state is talking about or sharing policies and procedures for children on IEPs, make sure that people have thought about, thinking about, and always planning for young children. So we want to be careful that our youngest citizens and those who care for them aren't further silenced or marginalized. And that's been a big conversation around who's caring for our children, and great possibilities and hope that we will now value the work that so many of your parents, you do, your colleagues do, your siblings, and that's in the early care and education, whether you're a parent, a child care provider, a teacher of young children. So, Pam, I've been thinking about your mom a ton this last week. So we want to really be thinking about being at the table so that any practice, policy, procedure, handout, download podcast that we're giving out suggestions really thinks about 619. So 619, eligibility, IEPs, and accountability all have some special language for our youngest citizens. And so in particular, you'll hear a phrase, appropriate activities. And so when we think about what are you eligible in? The question is, do you have access? Can you participate and make progress towards what? Well, for 619 kids, those are preschoolers with identified disabilities, it's access, participation, and progress in appropriate daily activities. It's nothing about a preschool classroom, though appropriate daily activities could include a preschool classroom. So really, if you strip it back, while preschools are closed, it's like one tiny part of a child's appropriate daily activities. So the question all along should, could, will be, does this IEP support a child's access, participation, and progress in appropriate activities, which could be a 24-hour clock. Same goes for the IEP language around 619. It talks about does your present level, do your needs, and do your IEP goals all address this child's needs in accessing, participating, and making progress in appropriate daily activities. Julie Costin, Dr. Julie Costin from Inclusive Schooling, again, all of these links are in the show notes for this Facebook event. Her latest podcast, I think it's 25 or 35, can't totally remember, but the link is there. Just go to Inclusive Schooling, go to more, go to podcast, and you'll see her podcast about the virus and special ed. And she had a lawyer guest, and then a colleague of ours from Wisconsin, from Elmbrook Schools, was the other guest. And they both talked about what do we need to be thinking about. And the lawyer mentioned that one of the most untapped parts of federal law is that parent support. And so I typed off some things. I'm going to read a couple of comments to you. But this idea of how do we support parents during this time really should have been, could have been, will be part of a larger conversation of what IDEA, federal law for children with disabilities, has always called us to do. And that is that there should always be initial and ongoing training for parents, that ongoing training and support of parents can be and should be written into the actual IEP. So we get all a Twitter about, or twitchy about, whichever way, about specially designed instruction and minutes, and how are we going to deliver those, especially now that preschool's closed. Interestingly enough, we could have, shoulda, woulda, had something in the IEP already about how are we supporting parents or other caregivers to implement the IEP, not just about what does a teacher need or a therapist and so forth and so on. So that's an interesting little place of a possibility that was brought up in that podcast. And so it talks about that parent counseling and training can be anything from assisting parents to understanding their child's special needs, which, if you saw Barb Avila's podcast yesterday or the day before on applying the 4 S's, safe, seen, soothe, secure, from attachment science to children with autism, that would be absolutely something that we would be helping parents do. Not just work on children's IEP goals specifically, but helping parents form secure attachments would absolutely be something that we could be doing during this time under the IEPs, if that's what the child needs under these circumstances. Providing parents with information about child development, helping parents to acquire necessary skills that will allow them to support to implement their child's IEP or IFSP. So, and Ashley Lyons, who's also on the Facebook today too. And Ashley, if you want to put your email in the chat for people, you can, or we can get another way. Ashley's an advocate. She's a mom of children with diagnosis of autism and significant medical needs, and she's brilliant. So there you go. That's her resume at a glance. She can also help you navigate some of these kind of places and how would I talk to parents about this. But there are definitely parts that the lawyer that was in Julie Costin's podcast talked about that we haven't tapped into or leveraged the strengths of IDEA as much as we really could in terms of being able to support parents and other caregivers right in there, just as we would specially designed instructions. So that's an amazing possibility that's to come. Okay, so that's my quick thing about just making sure you understand that there is a special section in IDEA that is about preschoolers. There's also a special part, which is Part C, that is for infants and toddlers. So no matter what your district or your agency is doing in terms of procedures for kids on IEPs, make sure that the conversation is around also 619, which is the idea of sorry, I was reading Ashley's post and lost my train of thought. That idea of appropriate daily activities. Okay, next thing on my list. Also, let's just make sure, and this is not in the law, but this is like everywhere else, we need to be careful about screen time. So I know so many of you, some of you just jumped on, are doing amazing stuff through Skype, through Zoom, through FaceTime. Perfect and beautiful. I also want to just add on that as we talk to families and we create opportunities for our children to connect with us, make sure that we're also pairing that with a healthy mind platter. I think I put the link to that in the Facebook links as well. I'll make sure. And secondly, just screen time. Just this, you and me, us, is screen time. And all that it took me to prepare for this was more screen time. So just be cautious of that, so that if you start feeling like, okay, I promised everybody I would show up every day, but everybody's showing up every day. That's a lot of screen time for everybody. So maybe you decide that you record it, but they can have it when they need it, or it's live and recorded, or you do it just on Wednesdays. So just keep that in mind, guys, that as we're making sure that policies and procedures for older students and what we see our K-12 counterparts doing may not be applicable, especially for young developing brains. So just be really cautious and thoughtful about screen time. And I put links to the podcast that I did with fellow revolutionaries, Leslie from Nevada and Jolene and Ashley and Alicia from Idaho. You guys can get those as well, okay? So that's the next thing. Cliff Note version. As I mentioned, Dr. Julie Costin had a really good and super short, like 20 minutes long podcast, not like mine. My Cliff Notes take longer than her podcast, but she's inclusiveschooling.com. Go to the drop down of more, go to podcasts, go to her latest podcast. She said in the recording that she's going to put some downloads from Elmbrook Schools and other templates that y'all can use. I didn't see it at the time that I'm doing this Facebook Live, but I'll keep watching for it and I'll alert you the minute that they're there, because there are things that they talk about that sound really useful that you all might want to swipe. So a couple takeaways in case you didn't have time to watch it, or if you want to know, should I listen to it? So they talked a lot, and again, she had a lawyer And she had an amazing administrator from Elmbrook Schools in Wisconsin talking about these things. So there was this, my takeaways. Change of placement really starts to set in 10 days or longer. And so if anybody was worried that day one of the shutdown of schools was when we had to go immediately to doing something for children's IEPs, we've got some wiggle room. There's some case law, there's some legal precedent, there's some language that supports it, but we're all approaching that or have hit that in some places. So now the question that I was listening to was, what is appropriate in light of the child's circumstances? That was one consideration. The second consideration in terms of your responsibilities for a child's IEP, including our Section 619 kiddos, is what is reasonable and what would a reasonable person do. So they had a good conversation about what is appropriate based upon the child's circumstances, which is unique. So there might be children, as Ashley was mentioning, that have medically fragile issues or complex things that would be very different from a child that has Down syndrome or a child that has a developmental delay. So we don't want to take and make a decision for all kids with IEPs generally. That's going to be a slippery place down the road for lawsuits and just being human to each other. We have to have some individualization. We have to think about what do different groups of children with preschoolers need. Okay? So what is appropriate for the child's circumstances? So make sure that whatever district decisions you're making or agency or policy decisions around children's IEPs, you're thinking about what's appropriate for this child's circumstances, but then what's reasonable? What could a reasonable human do? Okay? So CEC, the Council for Exceptional Children, and the Division for Early Childhood. Many of you are members. You can do a heart or a thumbs up if you're a member of DEC and CEC. A great webinar came out at the end of the week as well. And there's going to be a couple more. So there's links to all of that. You can also become a member for free right now, which is like super, super amazing. A link is in the Facebook event to become a member of the Council for Exceptional Children as well. So that's a great place to say, this is my professional home and this is where I can go, because there's so much out there in terms of what you can consume and what's right and what's wrong. So there was a great webinar that CEC sponsored toward the end of the week that had more information. Just the handouts were useful. Even if you don't want to sit through the webinar, you can look at the PowerPoint that they share on the website. And it talks about a continuum of what your district may be doing, from completely no interaction to any students and no services, no schooling, no specially designed instruction, right? No educational opportunity for any student, all the way to variations of that. And so the first suggestion is figure out what your district is. Where are you on that continuum for students that don't have an identified disability? Then you can say, okay, now that I know where we are for all of our students, where does that mean that we have an obligation for our students with IEPs? The other thing that was in Julie's podcast, again, the links in the Facebook Live event recording, is that children with identified disabilities and students have actually special protections. So we can't just say, this is only what we're doing for students without disabilities. We have to do nothing else for a student with a disability. It's kind of the place you can begin. We can't do less than what we're doing for students without disabilities, but there's actually things that are special protections beyond just a free and appropriate public education, or what we call FAPE. So you want to be careful. And that was also what I took away from the lawyer's comments in Julie's inclusive schooling podcast, that might be the baseline, but there's some special things that students on IEPs are also entitled to, or considerations that we have to think about. So don't just go, well, this is all we're doing for kids without disabilities, so we'll be okay. Also, just from human to human, the reason we have IEPs is because what we're doing for everybody isn't enough to support you. And so by that kind of human response, we go, I might need to do something a little bit different. But we also don't want to flip our lids. We don't want to panic and say, oh my gosh, I have to provide so many SDI minutes for every kid. Remember, we can support families to implement IEPs. But again, we're not turning homes into special ed classrooms, but we can always think about, how can I support parents? That could be, how do I help parents with secure attachment theory, science, the 4 S's? How do I help families have a predictable routine, not a predictable schedule that's so rigid that makes everybody flip their lid, right? How do I help parents be a play partner? Okay, so students with disabilities have special protections beyond. So check out the CEC webinar. Check out Julie's podcast on inclusive schooling. Links are in the Facebook event. Next thing, Beth Rouse, a colleague of ours, once taught me this amazing thing about transitions. And she said transitions aren't just the moment when you're transitioning. She said transitions are what you do before, during, and after. How do you make it through the transition? Now, this is what we're doing right now feels like one big long transition. So that means we have to be thoughtful about what we're doing all along. And so what I took from the Inclusive Schooling podcast was communicate, 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 communicate. So if you're worried, are we doing enough for our preschoolers with IEPs? Check to see what you're doing in terms of communication and partnership with families. If you're doing what he talked about, the lawyer talked about, the hallmarks of the of IDEA and having an IEP in the first place, I want to make sure I got them. Disclosure, communication, parental participation, and individual determination. If that's at the heart and the spirit of what we're doing, then we're probably going to be just fine on the backside. If we're worrying about the technical timelines and we're worried about, is this goal measurable, and are we worried about who's monitoring the measurement, and did we do it 5 times because the criteria said he would do it 5 times, that's where we're probably going to get lost. If we get lost in the weeds. But if we can leverage what Beth taught me about transitions and say that this is all about communicating and planning before, during, and after, we're probably going to find ourselves in good shape. So leverage what you already know about how to make a successful transition and apply that to this really challenging set of circumstances right now. Okay. What else? Yeah, I just wanted to see if there was anything else on my list. That was kind of the big things that I wanted to talk through. So let's just kind of recap. On my Facebook page, there's events, and then today's event is there. There are links to everything, and then probably the things I forgot to mention so that you can have them at your fingertips, okay? We wanted to check in. We wanted to see how everybody was doing, so feel free to drop in the chat how you are. If you had a success, if you found something really useful this past week that you can share, you can drop it in the Facebook Live. You can also drop it to me, and I'll make sure to share it with other members of the Revolution. We just really want to celebrate the possibilities, but we also want to honor that this is heavy stuff, big stuff, and don't judge it. Like, that's my biggest thing. Like, my stuff is not as big as other people's stuff, so I diminish it, but it's all really big stuff, okay? So let and allow, process the big emotions, try to keep your prefrontal cortex intact. That's my goal for the week, is try to have a little bit more time that I'm not in the red or the blue. Then I went on to talk about Section 619, just to remember that there are some special things about preschoolers that we need to be careful that we're not further marginalizing our youngest citizens, not only just children in general care and education, but children who have identified disabilities and need for additional supports. It doesn't have to be harder, it just has to be individualized. So be careful when we're thinking about eligibility, when we're thinking about IEPs, and when we're thinking about accountability, that there's some different language in Section 19 for preschoolers. And then I gave you a whole bunch of resources, or my Cliff Note version from the Inclusive Schooling's podcast and the Council for Exceptional Children's webinar that came out, knowing that all of this is going to change daily, and I will try to continue to do a Sunday summary, sort of a recap of the best or the most important things, because you all are out there doing such important work. I don't want you to also worry, am I missing stuff? So just know that I'm kind of watching everything for you, and I'll try to get to you what's the most important thing. So my takeaways were: think about what is appropriate for this child's current circumstances. Those circumstances are going to change, so you've got to come back to and revisit. So even if you get something in place for the next week or month or 3 months, that might change after you've created it. So just with a little bit of grace and ease, keep coming back. Is this still appropriate? And then think about what is reasonable. What is reasonable? What would a reasonable person do? And that's sort of where people are making their decisions. Figure out where you are on the continuum of what your district is doing for students without an IEP as your bare minimum baseline. After that, be thinking about what does this student, not all students with IEPs because they're very, very different, but what does this student, or even if you have to cluster students, don't cluster them by label or by age or by another something that's not discerning, but cluster them by really their significance of their needs, whether that be language or development or current family circumstances in their community. So then you can kind of triage or tier and differentiate, because we don't want to do a one size fits all, because we know that one size fits all often fits no one. Okay. And then just see this all as a transition, and that we know that good transitions require good communication before, during, and after. So if you are working with your families before, during, and after any decision that's made by a district, that's a great place to be. All right. So those are my thoughts, revolutionaries. I'm just double checking my notes. And, as always, I'm so very grateful for each and every one of you. If any of you are still kind of trying to get through what we created this last week, Beth Diedrich, who's on today as well, we have that podcast, number 40, the Pre-K Teach and Play podcast that's still out and about. You can enter your name and email and get all our show notes. I'm also uploading all of these kind of resources about how to support preschoolers on IEPs on that landing page, so that you can always go there as a one-stop shopping place. If you're an ECE Solutionary member, I'm also keeping your library updated with everything that I'm sharing. So if you're not sure where to look, try going to podcast 40, prekteachandplay.com/podcast 40. Put your name and email to get our show notes. And then Beth and I and the rest of my team are keeping you updated as things relate to the virus and preschoolers on IEPs. That's one place you can go as a one-stop shopping. For anything that I'm creating and sharing to support you, that is in the ECE Solutionary membership place, or you'll find it here and there on social media, or you can just write to me and ask, and I will track it down. All right? So let's go give it a day. It's almost drink 30 somewhere. Even if it's not, I think it is definitely time for a beer. That's how I'm just going to end all my Facebook lives, is that it's beer 30. So thanks to each and every one of you who joined me or who are watching this back afterwards. If any of the links cause you a problem, or if I've misinterpreted anything, let me know. All right. See y'all.